Hello, 8th grade. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 16, Section 2, Challenges to Slavery. So, looking at our political cartoon here, we've got an issue here in our country. Obviously, we've been talking about slavery and Fugitive Slave Act, but we've got this cartoon that kind of makes me think of Gulliver's Travel. We got a giant here, and the saying down at the bottom is forcing slavery down the throat of free soilers. Free soilers are probably people who want free states. And you might see that there is a kind of a platform there that says Kansas, and there's a little saying under that. It says the Democratic platform. Political parties, they have like issues that they like to support, and they call those issues planks, and all those issues together they make a platform. So that's kind of what this is all about. And as you can see, we've got some politicians here kind of pulling the hair of this giant, and you might notice that there is a man being shoved down the throat of this giant, an individual who is probably an African American. Murder, help, neighbors help, oh, my poor wife and children. Okay, so the Republican Party is going to be formed in the 1850s, and it was formed when the anti-slavery Whigs, who were a political party kind of prior to the formation of the Republicans, and the Democrats happened to kind of join together with the Free Soilers in 1854. And what's interesting is they would have a number of people that were kind of well known that were members, and probably one of the more famous members of the Republican Party was not Abraham Lincoln. It was a guy named John C. Fremont, who's actually going to be the first Republican candidate to run for president. We'll hear more about that. So the main message of the Republican candidates in the congressional elections of 1854 was that the government should ban slavery from the new territories. Okay, so in 1854, Republicans won control of the House of Representatives, but they almost had no support in the South. Pretty much the Republicans dominated in the North, and the Democratic Party pretty much still had control in the South. So the elections revealed that the Democratic Party was becoming increasingly the Southern Party. In 1856, the presidential election was happening that year. The nominees for the candidates were John C. Fremont, Republican candidate. You see him pictured in the cartoon and in the illustration there in the middle. James Buchanan, who was a Democrat. Millard Fillmore, who was part of the American Party. And what's interesting is Buchanan is going to become your president. And I will say this about James Buchanan. If you look at list of people who were some of the worst presidents in American history, his name is up near the top because our nation was kind of falling apart, and he pretty much did nothing. In a sense, he probably was the one president that made it possible to fight a civil war, because he really was in no mood to do anything about bringing people together. So during his time as president, we're going to have a major court case go before the Supreme Court involving a man named Dred Scott. He was an African American. He was enslaved. He had lived in what is now the state of Missouri, but his slave owner had been a member of the military, had taken him, Dred Scott that is, and his wife Harriet, out of Missouri to a free state, and actually was up in what would now be present-day Minneapolis, kind of the Twin Cities, at Fort Snelling, okay? And then eventually was brought back to the St. Louis area. Well, he sued for his freedom in 1846 after his master, who was an Army doctor, had moved to Illinois, and then also Minnesota, being the Wisconsin Territory at that time, where slavery had been banned in 1787 before being brought back to Missouri. And with some support of some abolitionists in the St. Louis area. He was able to get himself an attorney, and he filed a lawsuit. And this court case is going to, start in Missouri in the 1840s, and it's going to work its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in the 1850s. And Justice Roger B. Taney, who you see kind of in his portrait there, who was from the state of Maryland. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that period of time. He applied the Fifth Amendment to this case. And there's one little caveat you should know, is that for any case to actually make it before the Supreme Court, where you have individual people involved, there has to be a constitutional question, meaning that there has to be an issue with how the Constitution is being implemented before that case could even be remotely considered for consideration before the court. So the ruling basically said that an enslaved person is property. And the Fifth Amendment prohibits Congress from taking property away without this thing called due process law. In other words, the government has to compensate people when their property is taken away. And so in the case of Dred Scott and his wife Harriet, Taney basically is saying that they're property and they're not necessarily people. And to go along with this, Taney's decision basically said that the ban on slavery in the territories was unconstitutional, making the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional and pretty much throwing a wrench into the whole compromise system that we've been talking about. Reality is that Taney basically said that Dred Scott and any African American in general really doesn't have any rights before the court because they're not U.S. citizens and thus are property. And some people would say this is one of the worst decisions, probably next to Roe versus Wade, that was made by the Supreme Court. It was kind of a lousy decision. So, Northern Republicans rejected the Dred Scott ruling on the principle of keeping slavery out of their territories. The South had threatened to leave the Union. So we're talking secession, but this is like, 1856. This is kind of like right at the beginning of Buchanan's presidency. In 1858, we got a major Senate race in the state of Illinois that pitted Republican Abraham Lincoln against Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. There is going to be a number of debates between these two in August and October of 1858. Sometimes we call this whole notion of these debates kind of like stumping. In other words, you're going around, you're kind of, telling people kind of your beliefs and you're debating one another, but you're also campaigning kind of at the same time. But they faced off in 7 debates. Through these debates, there's some pretty well-known, kind of sound bites, if you want to call it that. Lincoln talked about a house divided against itself could not stand, talking about how slavery dividing our nation, we will not be able to stand. We're probably going to end up having to fight, and how realistic that was. Stephen Douglas believed that the issue of slavery could be resolved through popular sovereignty. Let the people pick. Okay, that's kind of the democratic way, if you think about it. What's interesting is Abraham Lincoln had actually served in the House of Representatives. He was kind of a one-term congressman. He served 2 years and then he went back home because he lost re-election. But by the time we get to like the late 1850s, he's a little more polished and he's a much better debater. And a lot of people were taking note of his ability to kind of like just speak from the heart. He was not, kind of an Eastern polished politician. He was kind of a man of the people, and the people of Illinois, they really like that. And they're going to remember that because we're going to have an election in 1860 and he's going to have his name thrown in the hat there. So Abraham Lincoln opposed slavery because he believed it was morally wrong. Douglas claimed that Lincoln wanted African Americans to be fully equal to whites. I don't know if I can recall ever seeing that in any of Lincoln's speeches that I've read, but Stephen Douglas won this election by a narrow margin. Lincoln gained a national reputation and some haters down in the Deep South that were slave owners. They didn't like the guy. On October 16th, 1859, our friend John Brown, who we talked about earlier, who was in Bleeding, Kansas, he led 18 men on a raid at an arsenal in the lovely town of Harper's Ferry, which today is now in West Virginia, but at the time was in Virginia. This arsenal, not necessarily a huge building, matter of fact, really pretty small in comparison to what I think about what an arsenal is in this day and age. But the goal was to go in, capture some federal weapons within this federal arsenal, and enslave, or I should say arm some of the enslaved African Americans that were in that part of Virginia and have them start a revolt against the slave owners. Okay, so these men, they move in, they capture this arsenal, and then they kind of are like, I don't know, kind of like having to hold that property. And in the meantime, Buchanan makes a call to get some military support to go up to Harper's Ferry to stop this revolt. Local citizens and federal troops eventually are going to defeat Brown in this raid. And what's interesting is Brown is going to be found guilty and he's going to be sentenced to death by hanging. And this is all within like a very short period of time. This event happens in October. He is hung probably before we get into the early weeks of November. It was very swift and quick justice. But the soldiers that were led to Harper's Ferry were actually led by a guy named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is going to eventually go on to lead the Army of Virginia, for the Confederacy at one point in time. So Northerners considered John Brown to be a martyr, while the Southerners thought that he had been justly punished for what he had done, the crime that he had committed. And if you look at the photograph there of Brown and compare it to maybe the John Stuart Curry's, mural, the Tragic Prelude, there's some similarities there. The eyes that kind of just pierce your soul and kind of follow you wherever you move. I mean, that's the kind of guy John Brown was. So, thank you very much.